iMovie is working today, so I can do both recordings. Okay, so today we're going to wrap up our discussion of Macbeth. Um, I've got 6 topics that we'll take a look at over the course of things. Um, and the middle topics, 3, 4, and 5, I think are, um, you know, they're pretty closely linked. And so I'll take a break after the first two, then we'll kind of deal with 3, 4, and 5 together. And then I'll take a short break and we'll kind of have a wrap up of our discussion of Macbeth. Okay, so Macbeth as a tyrant. There's lots of evidence for this, obviously, and one of the things that Lewis says in the article that I suggested that you might want to take a look at, but which you may not have read at this point, um, is one of the things that he points out is that the topic of tyranny. So this is near the very end of his article when he's talking about the kind of implications of the play in terms of Jacobean ideology. Um, that the play itself is a sensitive. I mean, this is one of the dangers of Shakespeare having picked, or the risks that Shakespeare takes in having picked a topical thing to write about for the people who might be watching his play. Right? It's a topical play. It's a play that has a Scottish king, and England has just had a Scottish king has taken over the throne. It takes up this topic of equivocation fairly extensively. The concept of equivocation had been really a politically charged one in Jacobean England after the Gunpowder Plot, and it has that dumb show that we talked about last time, right? At the end of the last set of apparitions and visions that Macbeth has with the Weird Sisters, there's a line of succession, extending to the crack of doom, which is on the one hand, right, the crack of doom, that's the end of time. I mean, to kind of look back to Lewis's article, but it is on the one hand, I mean, that is intended as a kind of a compliment, right, to the sitting monarch, right? You've got, after having a queen who had no heirs, no issue, and who left England in a kind of instability about what was going to happen when she was done, when she died. With the ascension of King James, he's already got a family, right? He's married. He has he has 2 sons and a daughter, so he's got children, and so it looks as if there's going to be a kind of stability in terms of monarchical succession here, right? And so to put on stage this thing about Banquo's heirs extending to the crack of doom, that's a sort of a wishful thinking that the Stuarts will be perpetual monarchs for England, right? That there's not going to be an end to the line of the Stuarts. It's going to last until the end of time. On the one hand, the play is an attempt, or could be seen as an attempt on Shakespeare's part to, and also, I mean, the fact that the play takes up the kind of the occult and witchcraft and things like this, which is a kind of a hobby horse for the sitting monarch. So you could see the play as meant to be a compliment, but it runs certain kinds of risks, right? Because King James has a political ideology, and it is an ideology that is a change of pace from where Queen Elizabeth had been. In terms of actual practice, it probably wasn't necessarily all that different. But King James really asserted a number of times that the monarchy, that the king, has authority that can't be reined in by a representative body like Parliament. And Parliament itself is not a representative body, but something that resembles popular sovereignty. James made no bones about the idea that his throne was not responsible necessarily to Parliament. And just in terms of how historians talk about this rule, there's some debate about it, but there's an old-fashioned way of talking about this as, the second that King James comes down to England, he sets in motion the the wheels that are going to lead England to its civil war in 1642, which is basically over the unresolved problem of where does sovereignty lie in England? Is it a popular thing, or is it an autocratic thing? And James tends to be on the kind of more autocratic side of things. So, and autocracy, I mean, not to be political, but in our present moment, for instance, some people will refer, and I mean, it's on both sides of the aisle. People will refer to a president, our previous president, or the current president, as a tyrant, right? As an autocrat, a person who has a really strong personal vision and is going to make that happen regardless of the supposed checks and balances on that power. So when James, is on the throne and is ruling in certain kinds of ways, I mean, he fairly quickly generates an amount of opposition to his personal rule, and the language of tyranny starts getting thrown around. Okay, so I mean that's to kind of preface the comment about Macbeth being a tyrant. Lewis, in his article, for instance, says that that people don't throw that term around in the play until after Macbeth is dead, right? At the very end of the play, Macbeth is going to be executed, or he's going to be killed in battle, and the person who's going to succeed him, Malcolm, is going to say, I'm going to undo the work of this tyrant. But although the word doesn't get thrown around, the actions certainly suggest the idea of Macbeth as a tyrant. The fact that he basically is this sort of bloodthirsty figure who wants to maintain power, regardless of any kind of checks on him, when he has zero legal basis, right, for taking any kind of action against Macduff. Macduff is a feudal thane, right? He owes a certain kind of loyalty to Macbeth, and it's supposed to be mutual. The fact that Macduff has not come to Macbeth's banquet or anything like that—that's no basis for Macbeth to send assassins to his house and try to destroy his family. Macbeth is doing that because he wants to silence any kind of opposition. He doesn't want anyone to oppose his having assumed authority, right? He might be a usurper without being a tyrant or whatever, but I mean, like there's that action against Macduff. I mean, there's the fact that Macbeth is just a bad guy, right? He's a murderer who kills Banquo, and everyone suspects that it's his that Banquo's murder lays the responsibility for Banquo's murder lies at Macbeth's feet. Although there are various kinds of fig leaves about is maybe Fleance somehow responsible for that. But when someone goes and assassinates Macduff, I mean that's just plain tyranny, right? I mean that's just I don't want Macbeth don't want someone opposing me, and so the end of Act 4, Scene 3. The news hits Macduff very hard of he's taken a huge gamble, right? We talked last time about the fact that Malcolm is suspicious of Macduff having left his family unprotected in order to go and consult with Malcolm in England. But when the word comes that his family has been killed, Macduff takes it really hard. 2:17 of Act 4, Scene 3. It's on page 82. He has no children. All my pretty ones. Did you say all? I mean, you see him kind of just. I can't believe this, right? Malcolm and Macduff. There was their kind of conclusion in Act 4 from around line 230 to 240 is the idea of that Macbeth is he's alienating those who might support him, right? In fact, I mean, when the final battle comes, it's just a little sort of passing thing, right? But so this would be the kind of thing you could make an interesting quiz question about, right? Like, who are Macbeth's soldiers at the end of this tragedy? They're not Scots, right? He's got a mercenary army who's working for him because no one in Scotland supports him. And Malcolm says at Act 4, Scene 3, line 236, our power, right? Malcolm is about to lead an army of basically loyal Scots plus the interested English army of Seward. Our power is ready. Our lack is nothing but our leave. Macbeth is ripe for shaking, and the powers above put on their instruments. Receive what cheer you may. The night is long, but never finds the day. Right, and that is a kind of again, you know, a reference to inevitability. Right, that there is going to be this moment of accountability for Macbeth, but that Malcolm sees it um, as having a kind of divine aspect to it, right? That the powers above put on their instruments. That's a suggestion that that um, God, the divine, something metaphysical is going to fight on the side of Malcolm against the tyrant Macbeth, and work for the restoration of Scotland into health. Now, speaking of health, and this is moving on to point number 2. Lady Macbeth is in ill health, and in Act 5, Scene 3, the doctor who has been trying to kind of diagnose and treat her comes to report his observations to Macbeth. This is Act 5, Scene 3, around line 40 or so. And Macbeth asks, "How does your patient, doctor?" And the doctor's response is, "Not so sick, my lord, as she is troubled with thick-coming fancies that keep her from her rest." So I'm going to come back to these lines in just one second. This is the discussion of Lady Macbeth's illness. And Macbeth kind of is unhappy with the news the doctor gives him, and he says at line 49, "Throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it." And then he's kind of having this kind of distracted conversation with the doctor and with people who are helping him deal with the emerging crisis of an army showing up and so on, right? "Come, put my armor on, give you my staff. Satan, send out. Doctor, the flames fly from me. Come, sir, dispatch. If thou couldst, doctor, cast the water of my land, find her disease, and purge it to a sound and pristine health, I would applaud thee to the very echo that should applaud again. Plough, I say. What rhubarb, senna, or what purgative drug would scour these English hence? Hearest thou of them?" Now, that's an interesting kind of, I think it's an interesting kind of moment, right? This is this is a trope. We've seen this trope before. In fact, we saw this trope in the Richard II, right? The idea that the nation is sick, right? So you're personifying the nation here in this nation in Scotland, and it's dealing with some kind of a disease, and what is the proper diagnosis and treatment of this particular disease. The disease that Macbeth is concerned about is that there's this invading army. I mean, he doesn't have like the language of viruses or anything like that, right? But there's an invading army of English. What would it take to cure England of this invasion? And the kind of irony here is that the illness that has beset Scotland is the advent of Macbeth's reign, right? I mean, the fact that he is this tyrant who is self-serving, right? So even if you don't want to necessarily call him a tyrant, right, but that he's self-serving, that he is all about preserving power for himself. This is the problem that is making Scotland seem as if it were ill, right? We look back to and this might be interesting to Julie if she's still on the call, but and others maybe too. But we look back to Act 2 when there are reports about how the land itself has responded to the murder of the divinely anointed, right? This divine deputy Duncan, right? The legitimate king of Scotland has been murdered, and that has set Scotland into this kind of sickness, this illness. And I mean, the cause of that illness is Macbeth. And so this treatment that Macbeth would be asking for, if there were some kind of metaphysical doctor who could cure the personified Scotland of some kind of a disease, it's not just, I mean, heck, I'm not saying that there's definitely no way that Shakespeare could be thinking in these terms, but I mean, just kind of like think about it in our terms, I suppose. You could see the English army as kind of the antibodies that are going to come and fight the virus that is Macbeth. But he misunderstands it and sees the foreign invasion as the thing that is a threat to the health of Scotland. In any case, but it's that Macbeth is himself the cause of and his tyranny, his self-servingness, his quest for and thirst for and demand on holding on to power is the thing that is making Scotland ill. Okay, second point then, talking a little bit about Lady Macbeth's madness. So as a couple of people have mentioned in various responses that I've looked at, so Lady Macbeth, she certainly seems powerful. We've talked about the idea of the kind of conventions of the sex gender system and what a woman is supposed to be like versus what a woman is like, and she is acting outside of the kind of the gender and sex norms of the period and so on. She seems to be in control. Her sort of self-possession most of the way through the play, or this seems to sometimes make Macbeth anxious about his own masculinity, his own sense of his virility, his own sense of his power and so on. Like, for instance, the way that she tries to manage his sort of fearful response to Banquo's ghost, for instance, in the part that we were talking about last time. So it comes maybe as a little bit of a surprise that that Lady Macbeth kind of collapses at this point in the play. But it is how Act 5 begins, right? Act 5 begins with, sorry, let me get to the right page here. So in our text, this is on page 83. It's the beginning of Act 5, Act 5, Scene 1. A doctor and a gentlewoman who's an attendant on Lady Macbeth are talking about, something has been bothering her, and she's been sleepwalking, right? So the gentlewoman describes her sleepwalking, and the doctor's response to that is, this is Act 5, Scene 1, line 9. This is a great perturbation in nature, to receive at once the benefit of sleep and to do the effects of watching, which is another word for waking, right? So, sleep, which is, sleep itself is, right, a critical concept in this play, right, in this tragedy. When Macbeth kills Duncan, he says that he thought he heard some kind of supernatural voice saying, Macbeth has murdered sleep. That sleep and death are images of each other, right? And this is a concept. This is not, Shakespeare doesn't invent this, right? There's lots and lots of contemporary, that is early modern reference to the idea of sleep and death being kind of analogs for each other in some ways. And to be honest, right, looking back really quickly, I haven't really talked about sleep and death, right? But this certainly goes all the way back to early Christian language, and probably even before that. But when in the various letters, but in the various letters of the apostles, the epistles of the New Testament of the Christian Bible, when believers die in that first century after the death and resurrection of Christ, they've been waiting patiently for Christ for his second coming, which people have thought was going to happen early. Like Paul or whatever will say, so and so has various faithful people have gone to sleep. This person is sleeping in Christ and so on, right? That's a euphemism for death, right? So sleep and death being kind of analogs for each other, or kind of mirror images of each other. That has a kind of long Christian tradition, and it's being played on here. Anyway, back to the doctor in Act 5, Scene 1, a great perturbation in nature, to receive at once the benefit of sleep and to do the effects, that is, the actions of watching, of being awake. In this slumbery agitation, right, that's a paradox, slumbery agitation, besides her walking and other actual performances, what at any time have you heard her say? And the gentlewoman, that, sir, which I will not report after her, right? So not only has she been walking, not only has she been washing her hands in her sleep, but she's been talking in her sleep, and she's been saying things that are hair raising, right? And then on walks Lady Macbeth, and they observe her, and the doctor says at line 28, "What is it she does now? Look how she rubs her hands." This whole thing about rubbing hands, by the way, just a little side note, but um, uh, early on in the epidemic that we're going through right now, somebody posted the idea that you're supposed to wash your hands for 20 seconds. That's the CDC's recommendation on things. And they said, well, how do you know how long is 20 seconds? Well, just do Lady Macbeth's language while she's washing her hands in Act 5, Scene 1. Out, damn spot, out, I say. 1, 2, why, then's the time to do it. Hell is murky. Fie, my lord, fie. A soldier and afeard? What need we fear who knows it, when none can call our power to account? Yet who would have thought the old man to have so much blood in him? The doctor, do you mark that? The Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? What will these hands ne'er be clean? No more of that, my lord, no more of that. You mar all with this startling. Go to, you have known what you should not. Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh. What a sigh is there. The heart is sorely charged. Right? So, there's not a ton to this, right? I mean, this is the idea, right? That having participated in the murder of Duncan, that either out of kind of some kind of divine retribution or just out of a guilty conscience, right? That Lady Macbeth has been a partner in Macbeth's possibly manly ideas about, kind of taking action and killing and murdering and all these other kinds of things, right? So she is complicit in and accomplice to the murder of Duncan. She is, complicit in the framing of Duncan's heirs. She is, an accomplice and an accomplice to that. She's a complicit and accomplice in Banquo's murder, in the murder of Macduff's family, and so on, right? So, all those terrible deeds are weighing on her conscience. And this is, a way of explaining how her conscience is dealing with it, right? That she can't actually sleep, that she is sleepwalking and doing these kinds of acting out of her guilty conscience, basically, right? And revealing along the way, by the way, her complicity in those actions, and the doctor saying, "Oh gosh, these are things that you probably shouldn't be privy to." Of course, they are privy to. They're aware of the fact that Lady Macbeth is confessing to, well, she's not confessing to murder, but she certainly sounds like she's confessing to something along those lines. And so back to Act 5, Scene 3, when the doctor reports on this to Macbeth, Act 5, Scene 3, around line 40, this is on page 89, she's troubled, this is what the doctor says, she's troubled with thick coming fancies that keep her from her rest, right? She's troubled, right, in her sleep. She's got a guilty conscience or something like that. And Macbeth, cure her of that. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory of rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart. Right? So kind of looking ahead to us, right, and kind of modern psychological theory and so on, how do you deal with trauma, right? There's some kind of trauma, some kind of significant psychic event that is weighing on Lady Macbeth's mind, and Macbeth is saying, can't you give her some medicine, make her feel better from this trauma, right? And we might say the same things today to people who are traumatized. Can't you give them some kind of medicine? Wouldn't it be great if there was a pill that could sort of erase the memory of the bad thing that has happened to you? In modern I'm not a psychologist, right? But in modern psychiatry, there's an argument to be made that that being able to blank out a trauma might not actually be any better than living with the trauma, and that in fact there's the thing that has to happen is that you have to go through counseling and therapy, right, in order to kind of get through trauma, including the ability to kind of confront without flinching, I guess, or whatever, but being able to confront the traumatic event. And that's basically a version of what the doctor says here to Macbeth. No, I don't have a medicine, right? I can't, give her, licorice or whatever, which is an old-fashioned medicine. I can't give her this medicine and it'll kind of make her memory go away. She's got a rooted sorrow, as you, Macbeth, know. She's got the written troubles of the brain. Right? She's done these things. They're in her. They're inscribed in her psyche. And the doctor's response is the patient must minister to himself or herself. Right? The patient has to deal with trauma him or herself and can't have some sort of medicinal response to it and so on. And that then flips into Macbeth saying, well, then physicians are useless, right? What good is it to have a doctor if they can't cure you of that kind of thing? And then he turns the attention to the idea of a disease to Scotland and that sort of thing. Okay, so those are the first 2 points, talking about Macbeth as a tyrant and looking a little bit at Lady Macbeth's madness. I'm going to take a very quick break and come back on the questions of Macbeth's security.